the studio again today, Mike, and we have a special guest again with us.
Yes, we sure do. We have Pastor Bill Fowler with us from Fountain Gate Christian Fellowship.
All right.
And he's going to talk about conflicting worldviews in a postmodern world.
Okay, cool.
It's a great topic, and there's a lot to it.
Yeah, welcome.
And
Thank you.
Great. And so we'll get right off the top here. We'll say, okay, so is it really all that important to examine our worldviews?
Yeah, you know, Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And when you really think about it, a lot of people go through their lives and they don't even really know why they believe what they believe. They just kind of pick it up and they just kind of roll with it and that sort of thing. But worldviews are extremely important. They shape our perception of the world. They shape our value system. And eventually our worldviews bleed off onto someone else and theirs onto someone else. And pretty soon you've shaped the worldview of an entire culture. So worldviews make the world go round, so to speak.
Wow. So what exactly is a worldview?
Well, Carol Hill, I think, says this better than anybody else that I've read. She says, by worldview, I mean the basic way of interpreting things and events that pervades a culture so thoroughly that it becomes the culture's concept of reality. What is good, what is important, what is sacred, what is real, the beliefs and values and behaviors of a culture stem directly from its worldview.
Yeah, I gotcha. So postmodernism, let's define that. What is postmodernism?
Yeah, that's, you know, a word that you don't hear a whole lot about, but it's a very important word. It is basically a philosophy that says absolute truth doesn't exist, and those who support the postmodern worldview, they deny long-held beliefs and traditions, and they maintain that all viewpoints are equally valid.
Wow.
Of course, their viewpoint is the most valid.
Yeah, of course.
You know, Merriam-Webster, he has as partial definition to his definition of postmodernism is that it's a theory that involves a radical reappraisal of modern assumptions about culture, identity, history, or language. Now, you think about how much is going on in our culture where everything is being radically reappraised and radically challenged. Even traditional marriage, we've just seen that age-old bastion of that institution that stabilizes societies was challenged and basically overthrown.
Yeah. Well,
that's postmodernism.
Okay. Well, then how do we determine the validity of one worldview from another?
Okay. Well, that's a great question there, and there's really three truth tests to determine the validity of a worldview. And the first is just the common sense approach, the test of internal consistency. You know, if I walked into this room and said, I'm the Messiah, you guys would probably challenge that. I would hope
We'd
you
leave.
would.
We'd
You'd
leave. Yeah.
You'd leave. Because there's something internally inconsistent about that. But in our worldview, we have to evaluate anyone's worldview. How consistent within itself is that worldview? If there's numerous internal problems and inconsistencies in that worldview, then that worldview should be thrown out and not valued as a viable worldview.
Yeah.
I once talked to a man who claimed to be a Christian anarchist. And to me, that's an oxymoron. It's internally at odds with itself. And I sat down with this man and I tried to tell him that doesn't line up with the teachings of Jesus. It doesn't line up with the teachings of the Bible. Anarchy, by its very definition, has to do with lawlessness and destruction.
Yep.
And so to label that Christian anarchy, that is inconsistent. That's an inconsistent worldview. There's also people in the world, and a number of them actually, who believe that everything around us is illusory, that we really don't exist. This room doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And yet those same people are very, very careful about checking a highway, a busy road both ways
Right.
before they cross. You know, Mary Baker Eddy, the lady that founded the Christian Scientist,
Right.
one of their fundamental doctrines was that, you know, this was an illusory world, sickness was illusory, and that sort of thing.
Right.
And yet Mary Baker Eddy died in painful sickness, and she was heavily drugged on morphine when she did.
Yep.
So there again, that worldview doesn't really fly. And when you talk to a lot of people about their worldview, it begins to fall apart very quickly because they've never really examined it, and there's all
Right.
kinds of inconsistencies in it.
Sounds like to me like you're talking a lot about common sense here too.
There's a lot of common sense that goes into a worldview.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of common sense in what we call spirituality. If you show me someone who is just spiritual and they have no common sense, I wonder how spiritual they really are.
Really. Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
So the second test, so the first test is this internal consistency. That's the first test of testing a worldview.
Right.
The second is the test of relativity. In other words, how does this worldview relate to the facts of history, of science, of anatomy, of all the information that we have in the real world? How does this worldview actually relate to that? And if it doesn't connect into the real world, then again, you have to look at that worldview and
Yep.
and say that's a very flawed worldview. It's not one that I would recommend to people.
Yep. I see.
Let me give you some examples of these worldviews that are out there right now that are inconsistent in terms of relativity to facts of history and so forth. For example, revisionist history. We have a whole generation of young people that basically they have not been taught true history, not true world history, and not true American history.
That's for sure.
And so they literally believe, for example, that our founding fathers were a bunch of deists who came over and they were really greedy land grabbers, and the Puritans came over to take land from the Indians and so forth and so on. Let me give you one example of revisionist history and how it affects the worldview in terms of this relativity.
Okay.
In 1620, the Puritans, of course, they wrote the Mayflower Compact. And it says, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith in the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, and then they go on to talk about forming a civil body politic. It was the first governmental body that came to the shores from England. In our history books today, the words "for the glory of God" and the advancement of the Christian faith are taken out.
Yeah, for sure.
So what does that do? It shapes the worldview to make it look like our founding fathers were materialistic or,
Yep.
you know, here for all the wrong reasons.
I see what you
when
mean.
they
Yeah.
state there very clearly it's for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question where maybe you can answer this for me, because I'm always interested in how the millennials think. Why are so many millennials now, and I talked to one just the other day, talking about the virtues of socialism? Why do they do that?
You know.
And they do that because socialism is being taught as a virtuous worldview.
Yep.
It's being taught, both socialism and communism is taught as a virtuous worldview.
Yep.
But when you begin to really break it down and explain socialism to young people, to the millennials and so forth, they begin to understand, oh, that's not like that at all. Let me give you an example of what I'm saying. Some years ago, I went over to Romania. Now, Romania, until 1991, they were under the communist dictatorship of Ceausescu and his wife, who was just as brutal as he was.
Right. Yep.
And I talked to a number of 30-something-year-olds and 20-something-year-olds and of course older people too. And they told me about the horrors of living under communism. And when they overthrew Ceausescu and summarily executed him and his wife,
Right.
Romania was free
Yep.
back in 1991. And every July the 4th, they celebrate America's independence.
Wow.
They celebrate the 4th of July, and they celebrate it all out. But one of the questions the young people asked me over there is they could not understand why young people over here and Americans in general want to move towards socialism and communism when they are coming out of it. Well, the difference is that you can have a theoretical worldview that's not really relative to the real world around you.
Yep.
And they knew the reality. And people over here just know the theory.
I'm glad you had that story. That really brings that out a
Yes.
lot. That's a good one.
And if you talk to people, a lot of people's worldview is based on their emotions or
Yep.
some traumatic experience they had or whatever. And when you really begin to, are just noble ideas. Christians, a lot of times, they'll be so full of the Bible, and yet they'll have all the answers. But when you start talking to them, there's a great disparity between their theology and how they live.
Yep.
And the world checks us on that, and they rightly should.
Yep. Right.
So when we're looking at a worldview, you test it with internal consistency, you test it with a relativity to known facts around you, and then you also test it with a test of livability. After you get through theorizing and arguing your points on worldviews, you have to ask yourself at some point, if we take this worldview as the main worldview of our culture, what are the implications? What are the real ramifications? And I think that's something we should always evaluate when we're testing the validity of a worldview. For example, let's look at the implications of Islamic infiltration into America. If that continues, what will be the implications? What is the dominant core worldview behind Islam? Is it really and truly a religion of peace, like we're constantly told?
Right.
Well, 1,400 years of history tells us otherwise.
Yep.
And if we wanted to dismiss the 1,400 years of history, we could just look at 20 years of history and clearly see that it is an escalating political, religious ideology
Right.
where lives are lost unmercifully all the time. So there's that disparity again. You can't live under, you can exist under Sharia law, but you can't live under it. You can't live freely under communism. You can exist under it, but you can't live under it.
Right.
And so that's what you try to get people to see is you try to get them to think through the implications of their own worldview.
And Pastor Bill, if I could interject something here.
Yeah.
I deal with a lot of young people in the ministry, and one of the things, being a former educator and as a pastor teacher now, one of the things that we taught kids for years was a thing called point of view. When something is written in a book, it's written from a point of view.
Right.
And
Very good.
I think that's where some of the revisionist history goes back to.
Sure.
Is
Oh,
that
no
they're saying
doubt, yeah.
it depends on your point of view.
Yep.
And that whole concept now, today, seems to be driving forward. Even what your statements were about a Muslim, it depends on people's point of view.
Right.
Yep.
And there's a million point of views
Right.
that could be thrown out there. And the undercurrent of the philosophy of postmodernism is throw out God's point of view
Yeah.
and insert your own.
Yes. And in order to do that, they also have to dismiss historical facts.
Correct.
And so that's what the young people have been presented. Some of the greatest scholars that examine the textbooks in America say that children in public schools, there's not one single school child that has ever read a true, authentic American history book.
Right.
Not one. They've been taken out.
Yep.
And they've been rewritten with all of this, anything to do with Christian faith and virtue and the faith of our founding fathers or the faith of the heroes of history coming up.
Yeah.
They take all of that out. They make it all about materialism and the American dream, which was never the American dream originally, to just come and make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
They just seem to make the point of view, your point of view, all level with everybody else's.
Right.
And so no superior point of view. You can think you're a cat if you want to think you're a cat.
Yeah.
Maybe unrealistic. It's not truth.
Right.
But that's even question. What is truth?
Mm-hmm.
Well, exactly. And that's where you get into this, the reason we need to test the worldviews to see if they're relative to the laws of nature and that sort of thing. I read today where in Charlotte, North Carolina, the public schools have said we're no longer going to refer to students as boys or girls.
Oh boy. Yeah.
So, when gender, which is an anatomical fact, right?
Yep.
It's an anatomical fact.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
When it becomes subjective rather than objective, all bets are off.
Mm-hmm.
Everything gets redefined then. And it goes back to what you're saying there, Pastor Rick, that these young people are taught there is no absolute truth. There's nothing you can hang your hat on. It's just your opinion. But there are facts of nature, there's facts of history, there's facts of science that are inviolable,
Right.
that they have to be turned to and said, look, this is the reality of it.
And it seems like also part of the problem is that our kids are being taught not to do that, not to think for themselves,
Not to think.
not to think over what is this, not to question, but just what we tell you is good enough. You don't have to delve any further into anything. And so we're being taught not to think for ourselves about all this stuff.
Well, you bring up a really good point, Mike, because Bertrand Russell, who was a Fabian socialist, he was a Marxist, he said years ago, he said the school classrooms of tomorrow will be transmission belts for socialism. The teacher will be able to take the students and pump into them whatever information they want to have, and they will do so with such ability that they will be convinced that snow is black, if that's what they want them to believe. He said that it's not about teaching them information of facts of history and science and so forth. He said the objective is that they would come out of high school or graduate from school with the right answers to certain questions.
Mm-hmm.
And they do.
Yeah.
When you talk to them, it's group think almost. They answer the same thing almost robotically. You don't see a lot of creative answers there.
And you see this all the time because you see people repeating things that they've heard on TV or on the news or that they've read in the textbooks as it's an absolute matter of fact.
Yes.
Because they saw it on the TV.
Yeah. And we all know that, whatever is on the internet can't possibly be false.
No, it's got to be right every time. You bet.